Was just finishing off a different documentary at the time and working with my friend and collaborator Stephen Schwankert, who's a maritime historian. I'm not, and he told me the story. He mentioned just the sort of the headline. There were 6 Chinese survivors of Titanic, and at first I thought, well, maybe I don't know this because I'm not Chinese, even though I spend a lot of time and live in China. But it turned out to be true, and it seemed that no one in China knew it, and that began a fascinating journey that's taken us 5 years to complete.
Since there wasn't much of a paper trail, not a lot of records on these passengers, you and your team really had to play detective in a sense. How did you manage to piece all these stories together?
I mean, think of a way you might do it. We've probably tried that way. We've been to archives and libraries. We've pretty much doorstep people. Both Steve and I have a background in journalism, and I think it was a combination of historian skills and genealogist skills and journalism that brought us to finding, I think, pretty much everything that can be found about them.
How did these passengers survive? I mean, they had so much against them. They were on the lowest decks, and you know, it was such a harried situation. How did they manage to do that?
Well, they were professional sailors. They weren't working as sailors on board Titanic. They were passengers. But we believe the evidence suggests that they were able to get to the boat decks much quicker than most third-class passengers, and they did that through a combination of luck. I think it always required luck to survive Titanic, but a lot of savvy, a lot of skill and knowledge. They sort of followed their noses up to the top decks, going a different route than most of the third-class passengers, who tended to be gathered towards the stern of the ship and then stayed there too long. They got on the deck quickly, and then they looked for opportunities to get into boats that had empty places in them, in lifeboats.
And you know, this story has not been known to most of the world, and even to the descendants of these survivors had no idea. So how did they react, and what was it like to meet them in person and share these stories with them?
Well, that was the biggest privilege of all. You know, a privilege of a lifetime, really, for a documentary maker. They were humble. They were always uncertain whether the inklings of an idea that they might be related to Titanic. They were always uncertain about it, and I think what we were trying to do was help them to complete that story so that they could talk about it with friends and other family. It's amazing how we've managed to go 109 years without the Chinese descendants talking about it, because this is a story that I mean, when I was a kid, I knew a Titanic descendant. She lived in my village, and everyone knew who she was, and she was interviewed regularly by the press and so on. So these are normally people who have a story to tell, and they're not normally reticent to tell it. But in this case, for lots of historical reasons and family reasons, they didn't tell the story, even if they knew it, which some didn't.
Where are these families now? Are they sort of spread out all over the world?
Well, we know there are families in the U.S. That we tracked one of the stories through to Canada. We believe that 2 or 3 of the survivors actually made it back to Asia, and by about 1920, so 8 years after the sinking of Titanic. And we know there are relatives of some of them in the south of China, in Guangdong, in a particular area called Taishan, and we were able to track them back to there. So pretty much spread out all over the place. In some cases, they were not able to settle because of discriminatory immigration laws. So most of the survivors who were in England for a while ended up leaving in a sort of mass, fairly secretive deportation that happened after the First World War.
You know, speaking of racism, the racism that they dealt with, unfortunately, has parallels with what we're dealing with now, with anti-Asian, hate around the world. What does it feel like to have this documentary have even more resonance today, and have parallels with what happened more than a century ago?
Well, of course, from the beginning of the project, there were problems in this story that we needed to overcome, and one was that they were so badly talked of in the days after the sinking, as if they had done something terribly wrong. The media, some of the media in the US and particularly the UK, wrote about them as if they were stowaways, They were described as having dressed as women in order to save themselves and get on lifeboats. So we went back to basics to look at those claims and to work out if there was any truth. And we promised ourselves if there was some truth to it, we would say it. There was no point in hiding it. But as we examine those claims, it's interesting that we all know what's happened in the world in the last couple of years, that the issue of Asian hate, violence towards Asians, and general discrimination has come to the fore. And the parallels were extraordinary. I mean, as we looked through, we found that a lot of the types of discrimination have reemerged in the same form. It's not legal anymore or about immigration, certainly in most countries, but the parallels were remarkable.